So that's been frustrating, I think, for a lot of people.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Facebook Live with the Horticulturists. We are the Horticulturists here to answer your gardening questions and talk about what's happening in the gardening world. My name is Candace Hart. I'm the Illinois State Master Gardener Specialist for U of I Extension, based here in Central Illinois. My specialty tends to be flowers of any kind. So if you have questions about annuals, perennials, landscaping, that's what I love to talk about. But luckily, I have some other great colleagues who like to talk about other gardening topics, and we have a special guest with us today. But we also have our usual horticulturist, Ryan, as well. So Ryan, you want to introduce yourselves?
Yeah, so I'm Ryan Pankow, horticulture educator out of Champaign, and my specialty is trees and shrubs. That's kind of my first love in the world of horticulture, but I'm also into native plants, and I also do a lot of vegetable gardening. So in the absence of Kelly, though, we do have a special guest joining us today. So Diane, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you guys so much for having me. My name is Diane Pleva. I'm the plant clinic director and the diagnostician here at the University of Illinois Plant Clinic. My specialty is plant diseases, but I also can do some rudimentary identification of insects and other plant pests, abiotic issues, things like that. I actually was trained as a field crop pathologist, so corn and soybeans, but my background has rapidly expanded with having worked at the clinic for about 7 years now. And so now I see a lot of trees, a lot of ornamentals, a lot of turf, unfortunately, not my favorite, but we can talk about that if people have questions. So just, trying to help people figure out, what's going on with their plants and talking about plant health information kind of in general.
Awesome. Well, we appreciate you being on, and we appreciate all the work that you do, because we send a lot of our problems to you a lot of the times. Like, help us with this. We appreciate it. So I think we're going to kick off the day before we kind of get into what Diane wants to show us today. Talking a little bit about seeds, because if you've been watching the news or if you've been watching our social media posts, you've probably seen some of the news stories about unidentified seed packets coming in the mail from China that don't say what the species is. You didn't order them. They just show up in the mail. So we wanted to kind of talk about that a little bit, about kind of, obviously, if you receive a seed packet that looks suspicious, especially if it looks like it's from China or another country, then we recommend that you don't plant it, of course. But we also want to mention, too, that we did with Extension, we just did a marketing campaign to promote the census, in which we also sent out some pollinator seeds of our own. So those, in fact, are legitimate seeds that you can plant in your garden. They did come from us. They didn't come from out of the country. And we have a news release that we'll share in the comments there. But Diane, do you want to mention maybe kind of if someone does receive a packet of seeds that looks suspicious, what should they do?
Yeah, so if you receive a packet of seeds that looks suspicious that you didn't order, especially if it doesn't have contents listed, it comes from an address or a company that you're not familiar with, what you want to do is you actually want to retain the seeds and the packaging. You don't want to throw anything away. You don't want to plant any of it. I know there are some people that really want to know what it is, and I get that, but you don't know what it is, and you don't know what might have hitchhiked its way over on the seed, because we have no idea what it is or where it came from. So you want to hold on to the packaging and the seeds, and then contact the United States Department of Agriculture. There is I think it's under their smuggling and a section, but there is a section of the USDA that their job is focused on, plant biosecurity. And so you can report if you received an unsolicited package of seeds, and they might ask for a picture of the packaging or a picture of the seeds so that they get a better idea of where it might be coming from. And then they'll give you instructions on how to destroy the seeds. But you want to hold on to everything until you've heard back from them, so that if there's any additional information they need, you can provide that. And that information, I believe, is either in the press release, or I can also get that information if needed.
Yep, we've got that link to the press release in the comments. So yeah, definitely check that out. Luckily, it sounds like we haven't, that we're aware of, any reports of people in Illinois receiving those yet, I think. Sounds like.
But as far as the extension seeds that did go out that are legitimate, yes. There's our, it's got our emblem on the back. It talks about extension, and so it's not going to be confusing, the extension seed packets. If you just kind of look at them, there's a nice picture on the front.
And they're labeled with what the seeds are.
Yeah, it has the species on it, so you can certainly kind of research. Forget-me-not seeds, I think, is what mostly went out. So you can plant those in your garden and do a little bit of research on those before if you want to. So awesome. Well, we wanted to touch on that. If you have any questions about that, definitely put it in the comment box, and we'll chat about that probably again today too. If you have other gardening questions, start adding those to the comments, and I see some coming in already, so that's great. But I think we're going to kick off with Diane. I know you had some fun pictures of stuff to show us of what you're seeing right now. So
yeah, let me go ahead and, oops, hit the wrong button. Let me try that again. That. All right, so hopefully you should be seeing the PowerPoint kind of splash page. These are common to diseases. This is actually stuff that I've just been seeing coming into the clinic in the last month or so. Also stuff I've noticed just walking around my neighborhood. I did want to put out a plug for the Home Yard and Garden Pest newsletter. The link is right there, and we can also put that in the comments. That comes out every other week during the growing season. I know that Ryan and Candace and Kelly have written for it before. It's searchable, so if there's any of the things that we talk about, especially the disease issues that we talk about today, if you're more interested in more information, especially information from Illinois about how to manage these diseases, you can go to that newsletter and search for a specific disease, so or pest issue or weeds or things like that. So it's a helpful newsletter. Oops, and now my arrow keys aren't working. There we go. All right, so we saw a lot of fungal leaf spots, especially early in spring. A lot of these were caused by anthracnose diseases. There are tons of different fungi that cause anthracnose diseases. Basically, they're characterized by like big, dark, brown, black, amorphous lesions. So just kind of a blighting that will occur. If it's really bad in spring, a lot of times trees will shed their leaves and then they'll put out a fresh flush of leaves. And if those come out when it's a little bit drier and a little bit warmer, a little bit later in spring, those leaves will often be fairly unaffected. Anthracnose is really ugly, but in general, it's not considered a huge threat to healthy trees. Sycamores can be a little bit more susceptible to anthracnose. They tend to get some more like branch deformations as well as leaf deformations. And then in very cool wet springs, if the disease is very severe, oak trees can also show some like witches brooming, some branch abnormalities. But again, generally speaking, not a big deal. The other nice thing is that these are all different types of fungi. So if your sycamore has anthracnose, that doesn't mean that your maple is going to get it, because they're, again, totally different species and even genera of fungi. So these are just some examples, some pictures I took. Like I said, a lot of anthracnose. We also saw a lot of blistering, and that's going to continue. Like we'll continue seeing that through summer and as it gets later. So a lot of like maple leaf blister, oak leaf blister, peach curl. So these are all Tephrinus species. They just cause like wrinkling, dark wrinkle blisters of the leaves. Again, not super pretty, but not going to hurt the tree. Management is just sanitation. So end of the year, rake any fallen leaves, mulch, water, fertilize, kind of your general maintenance. So definitely not super pretty, but not a huge problem. Yeah, Ryan.
So Diane, this year was pretty bad for anthracnose. I'd say last year probably was too. Would you agree?
Yeah.
You guys see a lot last year?
Yeah, and so anthracnose is favored usually by like cool, moist conditions. Most fungi like wet conditions or high humidity. And so as we have like springs that either have periods of coolness or even like moderate temperatures, so some diseases we're seeing more of as we're getting more kind of super wet springs, because we have had kind of some record-setting wet springs in the last couple of years. And so as we get all that moisture early in the season, that really kind of gives the fungi the kickstart that they need to really take off and colonize those leaves. There's kind of a rule of thumb that with most diseases, the earlier they show up in the season, the more severe they're going to be, because it just gives them a longer chance, a longer season to develop. So as we're getting these, again, kind of wetter springs with moderate temperatures, that's becoming, we're beginning to see, like you said, more of these kind of anthracnose and other leaf spot diseases. Not pretty, but the good news is, again, not super harmful to the trees as long as the trees are in otherwise good health. Yeah. Oops, sorry. arrow keys are not working, so I have to remember to use the mouse. Apple scab, I just started seeing this around town the last couple of weeks. This is really common, especially on like a lot of crab apples that are used, in a lot of ornamental plantings. So you just see these like dark, usually greenish brown spots. They sometimes have a velvety appearance. They sometimes are a little feathered looking, like the margins aren't, super distinct. They're kind of a little more diffuse. In severe cases, the leaves turn yellow, and then the entire tree can defoliate. If again, in severe cases, there are management techniques for this. The best thing you can do is, if you are planting a crab apple, select a resistant variety. Like, that's the best thing you can do. Not super helpful once you have a tree that is turning yellow and shedding its leaves, but in the future, if you plan on planting another crabapple, consider looking for resistant varieties. If your current crabapple is showing some distress, management is, again, sanitation. So rake and remove leaves. And if you can do it during the growing season, as opposed to waiting till the end of the season, that's ideal. So rake and remove as many of the fallen leaves as you can. And then there are fungicides that are labeled for use against apple scab. The good news is they're fairly effective. The bad news is they need to be applied in spring. So applying a fungicide now, once the symptoms have developed, will in no way be helpful. What you want to do is apply the fungicides in spring, and there's kind of an entire period. It's from when the leaves just begin to emerge until 2 weeks past petal fall. So it's a several kind of week, there you go, period that you're going to be applying these fungicides at labeled interval. It's usually every 1 to 2 weeks or so. Again, very effective, but it does take some management earlier in the season. And this can be, if it's, again, a year that is really conducive to fungal activity, which tends to be high humidity and high moisture and medium to high temperature, which we tend to see a lot of in Illinois, then this can cause severe defoliation, and that repeatedly over several seasons can cause problems to the tree. So it is something you want to keep an eye on and possibly treat. Oak wilt, we've had 2 samples test positive for oak wilt so far this year, which is not great because oak wilt is lethal to oak trees. It tends to be more severe on red oaks. It causes decline and death usually within a season or 2. In white oaks, it will take a couple years to kill a tree, but it will kill mature oaks in a couple of years, which is really sad when you have a several, 80, 90, 100-year-old oak tree. The kind of classic symptoms are this half-leaf scorch that you can see on the right-hand picture, so that it looks like someone took the leaf and just kind of dipped it like in brown paint. So it has the scorch that's occurring from the tips inwards. And again, it's usually a rapid decline. And then if you cut branches, if you see this dark streaking or the kind of the circular pattern of dark speckling in the vascular tissue, which is what you're seeing on the left-hand picture, that is characteristic of oak wilt. There are a lot of fungal cankers that can also cause this type of discoloration, and fungal cankers are usually considered less problematic than oak wilt, but this is, still, it's something that we keep an eye out for. It's especially problematic if it shows up, obviously, in like in a forested area or in a park district where there are a lot of oak trees planted nearby. So it's something to definitely keep an eye on. Management consists of immediately removing that tree, because all you're doing is keeping a lethal pathogen in the environment. So you want to get rid of that as fast as you can. And then trenching around the tree to break any root grafts, because that's one way that the pathogen can spread. If you have like a really important white oak, so, a white oak tree that Abraham Lincoln planted or slept under or something like that, or something that's really critical to a landscape or, again, has historical importance, there are injections of a fungicide that can be used to help protect white oaks. It works a lot better on white oaks than red oaks. I think they have to be done every year or every 2 years. They're fairly expensive. And at best, they're a protectant. So again, that's usually only used for trees that are like really critical, again, either to the landscape or for historical reason or something like that. It's not something we're usually going to do in our backyard. Diplodia Tip Blight, I think this is my second to last one. Diplodia Tip Blight is a fungal disease that shows up mostly on pine trees. It can affect other conifers as well. It tends to show up on 2 or 3 needle pines. So like Mugo, Austrian, Scots pine, those are all really susceptible. And basically it's called a tip blight because it affects the new needles. And so you'll have these branches where the older needles look fine, and then the new growth or the new candles are usually stunted and they're brown and they're completely dead. And this will continue for several years. It makes trees really ugly. It also causes cankers. So you'll end up with like these big sticky sap, like weeping kind of wounds on the tree. It's not fun. Unfortunately, management for Diplodia can be kind of difficult because the pathogen is in those dead needles. And so, sanitation can be kind of hard. You want to remove any dead limbs during dry weather so that you don't accidentally spread the disease. There are fungicides that can be used, but they have to be applied like 3 times during the season, and they may or may not be particularly effective depending on how severely infected the tree is. So really, with a lot of times when we see Diplodia, what we recommend is start thinking about replacements. There are resistant or less susceptible evergreens that you could consider. So if you have, a pine tree and you really like the fact that it's an evergreen and it's an important part of your landscape, you might want to consider, like, in a couple of years, maybe we'll do a replant with some sort of spruce, or we'll do a replant with like some sort of arborvitae or something like that. So start considering kind of what your replant options are, because rehabilitating badly infected trees with Diplodia is quite difficult. And frankly, it's usually just easier to start fresh with something that's less likely to be infected. And then this is my last one, and it's actually not a super common disease, but we've been seeing it show up a little bit more. So I wanted to just mention it because I think this is where my bias shows. I think it's really cool when we get new diseases, which I understand puts me at odds with most everyone else. But, I love my plant pathogens. So this is pear trellis rust. It's also known as European pear rust. It's a fairly new disease to the United States in the last couple decades. It's fairly new to Illinois just in the last, I want to say maybe 5 years or so. We've received a couple samples from northern Illinois, and then we've also received some samples from down near like the St. Louis area, but that was from a nursery. So, I'm not sure if it's really established in that area or if those were plants that had been brought in from somewhere else. But pear trellis rust, it's one of the gymnosperangian rusts. So some of you might be looking at this saying like, oh, that looks like cedar apple rust or cedar quince rust. And you are right. It is in that same group of rusts. But it tends to form slightly different. The lesions can look kind of similar, like in that bottom left picture, but the lesions tend to get a lot bigger and more necrotic. So you get a lot more brown tissue as opposed to just like kind of the yellow tissue or the yellow and brown spots that you see with the other rusts. With the pear trellis rust, you tend to get more of these like big dark splotches. And it tends to show up in July, August, September. We'll start to see more and more of it show up. It's a little bit tricky to identify because you identify it based on this one structure that tends to not develop until like September. So we'll get samples. In fact, the upper right-hand picture is a sample that we received earlier this year. And I am 99% sure it is pear trellis rust, but we are waiting on a resample from later in the year so that we can confirm it once these other fungal structures have developed. So again, it's a little distinct from the other gymnosperangian rusts just based on kind of the large blotches that develop. This isn't something that I think most people are going to see across the state, but if you see something like this, consider sending us a sample or send us some pictures, just because, anytime there's a new disease, we're kind of curious to know where it is and how it's affecting plants and in this case, trees in our area. Management is going to be sanitation. So again, raking and removing fallen leaves. And there are, you can remove junipers since juniper is the alternate host, or you can plant resistant junipers. There are fungicides that are labeled for use against the other gymnosperangian rusts that should be effective, but I'm not sure if there's been any actual research to show that. But since they follow, they're closely related pathogens and they follow similar life cycles, theoretically they should be effective. But again, they need to be applied in spring. So by the time you're seeing symptoms in summer, it's too late for this year. So anyway, those were kind of my handful of diseases that I've been seeing a lot of in the last couple of weeks. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing.
Awesome. Thanks, Dan. That's super helpful. And I think, let me see, I know we have at least one follow-up question. Susan asked, when you were talking about oak wilt, does oak wilt affect burr oaks?
Yes, it affects all oaks. So burr oaks are in the white oak family, or in the white oak group. So it means that it affects them less severely. They will still die, but it takes several years as opposed to 1 year. The good news, we're going to put that in quotes, is that there are other diseases that can look similar to oak wilt. On burr oak, there's bacterial leaf scorch, which can look kind of similar to oak wilt. And then there is burr oak blight, which can cause a tip dieback on the leaves. It usually causes more of a V-shaped lesion. So if you have your burr oak leaf, you look at it, if you see like a V-shape or a wedge shape necrotic lesion from that tip coming back and then it runs into a vein and it stops, so that's why you get that V-shape, that's more likely to be burr oak blight, which is less severe than oak wilt. So yes, burr oak can get oak wilt, but there are a couple of other things that it could kind of mimic as well. So if you are concerned, you can always send a sample to us so we can test it, and we can test for all three of those things that I just mentioned, along with other various fungal problems, bacterial problems. So if you're interested, you can go to our website. I'll put that in the comments. But if you just Google Illinois Plant Clinic, it's the first thing that pops up, and it gives information about like what type of sample to send and things like that.
Perfect. And maybe I'm remembering this wrong. Does oak wilt require kind of specific mailing instructions?
Yeah, definitely. So oak wilt, the thing that's really frustrating is that the oak wilt pathogen can take down a 200-year-old huge majestic oak in like a year, right? So it's an incredibly pathogen, a very aggressive pathogen. But it's also kind of a pansy once you cut the sample. So we really recommend that with oak wilt especially, we need branches that are at least 8 to 10 inches long, about 1 to 2 inches wide. And the big thing is they need to be kept cool. So we recommend that you cut them right before you're planning on shipping them. And then we recommend you ship overnight if possible, 2-day priority if not, and include like a ice pack, or you can even include like a water bottle half filled up and frozen. Just keep that sample cold, because there have been instances where we'll receive a sample based on the symptoms, based on the streaking, based on the information that the client gave us. It sounds like oak wilt, it looks like oak wilt, but we can't get the bugger to grow because it died in transit. And so then all we can do is say we highly suspect oak wilt, which is not a very satisfactory answer when you are considering taking down a mature oak tree. You want to feel really confident in that diagnosis before you start taking down whole trees. So definitely shipping early in the week, keeping that sample cold. Those are really important. And if you have any questions, I think there's actually a Home Yard and Garden article about shipping oak wilt, and they can also contact us. One thing I was going to mention that I forgot at the beginning is that the plant clinic is open, so we are accepting samples. However, we have a skeleton staff this summer, and we are trying to rotate kind of when people are in the clinic so that we are reducing contact between our staff. So people are welcome to contact us. We are getting better about answering the phone, but it is still sometimes a challenge to get to the phone if there's only one person there and they're in the middle of something. So email is kind of the preferred way to contact us if possible. And thank you everyone who has contacted us for their patience, because again, it's been a crazy summer, as I'm sure everyone can relate to. So we are kind of doing what we can, but we are accepting samples and we are processing them, and we're actually doing pretty well with the timeline for the processing samples, but sometimes the getting back to people with emails and phone call is taking a bit longer than I would like, but kind of that's where we're at the moment.
Perfect. I was just going to ask that, kind of what your status was. Are you taking in-person samples? Like if someone lived in Champaign-Urbana, for example, can they drop it off as opposed to mailing yet?
Yeah, so if you live in the Chambana area, or I've had a couple of people that have driven in from like Springfield. I think they just wanted an excuse to get out of the house. So if you feel like taking a road trip to scenic Champaign-Urbana, there isn't a whole lot to do right now, but yes, you can drop off samples. Our building is actually locked, so people cannot come upstairs and drop off a sample in the lab the way they used to, but we have a big green drop-off box outside the south doors of Turner Hall Hall, the building that we're located in, where people can leave a sample. We check it multiple times a day from 8:30 to 4:30 during Monday through Friday. There are sample submission forms there that they can fill out. People can also, again, give us a call or email us if they have questions, and we're happy to kind of walk them through the process.
Perfect. Awesome. Okay.
Yeah, so
no, go ahead, Ryan. Sorry.
Back to oak wilt just for a second, though. It's a serious disease.
It is.
These plants. I think some of the bottom line is even, if you have a tree that rapidly dies from something, and it's, we could maybe assume it was oak wilt, whether you get a positive identification or not. I think the biggest issue there is getting that plant removed and all that material gone and not further infecting more oak trees. So to me, when I've kind of dealt with it in the past, that's kind of been, there's been times I've came across something that looked very oak wilt-like, but there would be nothing we could send to the plant clinic.
Right.
Just hey, it's already dead.
It's
just
dead.
Get it out of here.
Yeah.
So that's part of the equation too, is just you need to get that plant out of there.
Well, and I think that's a really good observation. I think we get calls every year from people who their tree died last year, their tree died a year or two ago, and can they send a sample? And it's once it's dead, usually the pathogen is gone, because pathogens live on, generally speaking, they feed on dying tissue, not dead tissue. So I always tell people to send me your dying, not your dead, because once it's dead, all it can do is tell you it's dead, which is not super helpful, it turns out. But yeah, if you have a dead tree, get it out of there if you can, because no matter what it died from, it's, if it was a disease issue, if it was an insect issue, it's possible that it's still serving as a source of that pest or source of that pathogen. But even if it's not, you don't really want to have a giant dead tree on your property. That's a falling hazard, and that, can cause problems. And especially in summer, we have these freak storms. There's been a lot of downed limbs in my neighborhood, and some of it has been healthy trees that just split because we had crazy winds. But there have definitely been trees where it's that tree has been dead for 2 years, and so of course it's dry and brittle. So yeah, absolutely. If you're not sure what the cause was, it's still better to just get that tree out of there, get that plant out of there, because it's not coming back. So get it out of there, so you start thinking about what the new thing is.
And it's not getting any safer.
Right, exactly.
Target it can fall on. So yeah, but I guess there's, in the same context of this, there's maybe a discussion to be had in a forest that's different.
Right.
Where a lot of trees do die and of natural causes and really are an important part of that ecosystem for a lot of things. So
absolutely.
It all depends, as always, what the correct answer or correct action is, but that's something to think about. So we're not necessarily saying if you have a woodland behind your house and there's dead trees out there, you got to get them all out. Honestly, as a forester, I view those as a valuable part of that ecosystem. So, but the case of oak wilt is definitely a special case. And if it was in a forested stand, God forbid, that would probably be something that, you'd want to address or look at and try and stop the spread, even in a forest. So, just take some careful attention to maybe why that plant died or some of the signs we could look at.
Yeah, and I think those are really good points as well, that a lot of times management is going to depend on the situation, right? The correct response. People, and I understand, I do this when I go to the doctor. I just want to be what's wrong and how do I fix it? And it's going to, what's wrong with me as a 36-year-old woman might be a different management response than if they were 15 years old or if I was an 80-year-old. So, knowing what the situation is really going to help as well, because there are times, like you said, where it might be better, in fact, to leave. One thing that always comes up in fall is there's that discussion between, do you rake and remove the leaves, which from a plant pathology standpoint, heck yes, you do, because you get rid of all that potential inoculum, or do you leave fallen leaves because those do form an important part of the ecosystem in terms of an area for insects to lay eggs, in terms, and to overwinter, in terms of organic matter potentially being degraded and brought back into the soil. So there's always this kind of push and pull, what do you do? And for me, I've always said it depends on the situation. If you've had an outbreak of a disease, get rid of those leaves. If it's either your summer has gone fine, or if it's a disease that you have every year and you don't really care about, then you can leave it. But yeah, there's always kind of that people who, are adamant that you do not do any type of garden maintenance or sanitation until spring. And then the people that they want their yard looking like a high and tight, they want it completely tidy. And I think that there's probably a happy medium in there, hopefully. And it's going to depend on the season. It's going to depend on that year, what you saw in the garden and what sort of situations or what sort of problems arose.
Yeah, and I talk about not raking your leaves a lot. I mean, I love that. Like the fact that like, hey, you don't have to rake. You can be lazy. You can put those leaves there, and it's good for the bugs. It's good for the critters. But yeah, if you've got a known like foliar pathogen that's present on your trees, that's the time and the place to get rid of those. And you know, it all just depends for sure.
Yeah.
So one thing that I think is really interesting, and this actually, the study came from apple scab, but I mean, I believe it would hold true with a lot of our fungal pathogens. So a lot of fungal, especially foliar pathogens, they overwinter on the leaves, right? So the idea is that the leaves fall, they overwinter, and then in spring, new spores are produced, and then that starts that cycle of infection. They infect the new leaves, and then you get that whole cycle of infection again. So this was a study, it was done like back in the 70s, but it was looking at apple scab in commercial nurseries, because in commercial, you know, in actual apple producing nurseries, raking and removing leaves may not be very viable depending on how large that orchard is. And so what they ended up doing was, instead of raking and removing leaves, they just went in with a mulching lawnmower. So they just went in and they mulched all the leaves. They didn't remove any of them. They just shredded them. And then they left them under the trees where they normally would be anyway. And they found that they could get infection rates to decrease by 50%. Because basically what you're doing is you're kind of starting that decomposition of the leaves. And so I always tell people to think about the overwintering. So think about the leaves like a big fluffy winter coat. You know, that's how the pathogen overwinters. And if you go through and you shred that coat up, that pathogen is going to have a lot less protection through those winter months. And so I'll be honest, I don't know what sort of effect that has on, again, insects or amphibians or reptiles that are overwintering, you know, that might also be overwintering in that leaf litter. But that is at least one way to reduce the pathogens while not removing organic matter. So that's something else that, again, on either large scale or, I mean, I do it, that's my excuse for just going over all the fallen leaves with the lawnmower in fall and not necessarily raking and removing all of them, you know, here in town on a very small plot of land. So that I always thought that was like a really elegant way of kind of, again, trying to find that balance.
Nice.
Yeah, nice happy medium.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Total removal, and at least you're doing
There you go. Okay, let me scroll back up here. I know we've got some questions that have come in, some of them disease related, some not. So we'll see what we get. Anne asked, I have 2 new serviceberry trees that I planted last fall. They both got rust this summer. Anything I can do to prevent it next year?
I believe so, and I'm going to look that up really quickly so that I don't tell you the wrong information, but I have my reference right here, so let me look that up.
Yeah,
if you want to...
Yeah, we can. Do you want me to go
Actually, I just found it right here. Oh, so I got that information. There are things you can do. What's recommended in this lovely book, which hopefully there will be a somewhat new edition coming out in the nearish future, but I'm assuming you guys have probably talked about this in previous... Yeah.
Yep. Yeah.
So,
talk about it for a minute, though.
Yeah.
Sorry?
We can cover it here, though.
Yeah, it's been
really quickly. So this is Pest Management for the Home Landscape. It is published by University of Illinois Extension by extension specialists, mostly the Pesticide Safety Education Program. It's actually a really good reference. There usually are copies available at extension offices. So if you live close to your extension office, you can go in and take a look. This current edition from 2016 has 7 chapters, and they talk about things like managing insect pests in the home landscape, controlling weeds in lawns, controlling weeds in the home garden and landscapes, diseases in landscapes, so like in turf and lawns, and then also in gardens. So there's vegetable, fruit, and then ornamental and trees. And then talking about integrated pest management and pesticide safety. So it sounds like a really boring book. And I'll be honest, the first year or so that I worked in extension, I kind of would only use it as a table of fungicides. But there's a lot of really good information. It talks about, controlling creeping Charlie in your lawn. What should you apply and when should you apply it and how do you identify it so that you know that you're actually controlling the right thing. So stuff like that. It has a lot of good general information. I believe you can purchase copies of this book from most extension offices. I get absolutely nothing if you buy it. So this is not a sponsored post. But again, I do find this book really helpful. And the nice thing is that this book has it has the fungicides or the pesticides that are labeled for use in Illinois against the pests labeled. So if you go online and you look up something and you find a really good reference from, say, California, that reference, the information included is hopefully correct. It probably is. They have a very good IPM program. But if they give you a list of fungicides, those may or may not be labeled for use in Illinois because it's done on a state-to-state basis. So you want to make sure that what you're applying is labeled for use in your area. And also, depending on the weather or the environmental conditions, like the life cycle of an insect or of a fungus might be different. So if they say to apply it in spring in California, that might not actually be effective in Illinois. So that's one of the reasons that this book can be really helpful, along with using, validated internet sources. But anyway, to get back to the serviceberry question, you can apply, there's a fungicide with an active ingredient called myclobutanol. And I can try and type that into the chat so that you have that written down. The recommendation is to spray when the new growth appears in spring, and then you're going to continue at labeled intervals. And so you're going to read the label of whatever fungicide that you choose to use, and it should say like every 7 to 10 days during dry weather or something like that. But again, much like some of the other diseases I talked about earlier today, the application has to occur in spring. So applying something now will not be effective. Raking and removing the leaves won't help. It won't hurt, it won't hurt. But that by itself probably won't be enough. So you might want to apply a protective fungicide. Some people also are, they when we're talking about applying fungicides or applying pesticides in general, I think sometimes people think that they have to either like fully commit, like it's all or nothing. And so one thing I also point out to people is that you can kind of use pesticides in a way that fits your situation. So one example that I use all the time is with peonies. I love peonies. They're one of my favorite flowers. Candace is nodding.
Yeah.
Yeah. But they get a lot of different foliar diseases like measles and powdery mildew and spots and all sorts of fun things. To keep them looking pristine, you can apply fungicides. But then people sometimes worry about, am I going to be applying a fungicide multiple times a season, every season? Is that something I really want to commit to? You don't have to do it every year. So a lot of times what I end up doing is I apply a fungicide one year, my peonies look, picture perfect. The next year, they look pretty darn good. The third year, they're beginning to look maybe a bit ratty. And then by the fourth year, it's probably time to reapply. And so, you can kind of either by looking at the weather and if the spring is expected to be especially wet or especially warm, that usually means we're going to see an uptick in fungal diseases. So maybe you choose to apply a fungicide then. Or again, you kind of you live with it for a couple of years and then you apply it to knock back the inoculum in the landscape, and then you let it go for a couple of years. So you can kind of find what works for you. And I think sometimes, again, people feel like they're either committing to this like lifestyle of constant applications or they can't do anything. Mm-hmm. And I think that, again, you find what works for you. So yeah, I'm going to type the name of that fungicide. It's the active ingredient. So there will be a number of different compounds that will contain it, but you should be able to go to like a big box store or a garden center and find something that's labeled with this active ingredient for use on serviceberry or other like, deciduous shrubs or something like that.
Yeah, I think
Perfect. And we've got this question. Go ahead, sorry.
I think a good point on this question also was that wasn't it a newly planted set of serviceberries? Mm-hmm. Maybe this is the time that you would focus some of that control to kind of help your plant not be stressed as it's getting at overcoming transplant shock. And Absolutely. Maybe you could even expect in a few years, once it becomes established, for it to be a little healthier of a plant that could be more resistant on its own. So I'd say definitely a great time to be concerned is, these first few years following transplant as it's kind of, being nursed through that transplant shock.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. And we've got a link to the Pest Management in the Home Landscape book on the Pubs Plus site. So if you are interested in getting that, it's definitely handy to have on the shelf for sure. Okay, let's see what else we have here. Maria asks, my plants are getting small holes. Is it a fungus? Is it insects eating them? So Maria, it's kind of hard to tell without photos. So you're welcome to send a message to our U of I extension page and send any photos. But would you guys say for the most part, I would say holes is typically more of an insect symptom versus fungal. There are some fungal spots that can have shot hole, correct, where the center will kind of drop out. But
yeah, there's some bacterial spots as well, but those tend to be pretty focused on like specific hosts. So if this is like a cherry or other prunus species, then yeah, there are both fungal and bacterial diseases that can cause that shot holing. But I absolutely agree. Generally speaking, if you're seeing small holes in your leaves, it's usually because someone's nibbling on them.
Yeah, very good. And I'm going to scroll down here because since we're on the topic, Amy had a comment that our Japanese beetle infestation this year was much less than previous years. Is this a sign of them finally dying out? She's in Marshall County. I know I have seen fewer than typical here in McLean County as well, but I don't know that I've seen kind of research evidence that it's declining. Has anybody?
I think, and this is again this is me not as an entomologist, speaking. Yeah, anecdotally, I've seen a lot fewer this year, both in Champaign, Illinois, and then also just from reports that I've been getting from people across the state. So the good news is, yes, it seems to be lower than in previous years. However, insects, much like animals, much like diseases, like pathogens, they go through kind of episodic ebbs and flows of their population. So this year was a pretty good year. Well, it's always an awkward thing to say because sometimes when people say it was a good year for something, they mean there was a lot of it, and sometimes they mean there was none. So this was a pretty low year, I think, for Japanese beetles. But I mean, I don't think that means that, I don't know that says anything about like the next year or 5 years from now. I don't think we're ever going to hit a point where we don't have Japanese beetles, unfortunately, because that would be heaven. But I think that, and I wonder, and I don't know if this is, I know that some parts of the state had like freezes, pretty late in the season. So I don't know if maybe that also knocked down populations in spring. But I don't think, unfortunately, I don't know that this is going to be like a long-term trend.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking as well. Excellent. Okay, so for the rest of us are also not entomologists. And our bug lady Kelly is not here. But Julie asks, bean beetles, how do I recover my plants? So she has bean beetles on her plants.
Do we know what type of plants she has?
No, she did not comment. So Julie, if you want to add that would be helpful. But just in general, let's say if you did have a leaf that had some damage from beetles, whether it's Japanese beetle or something else, what would you typically recommend to remove that damaged foliage? Any other tips?
Yeah, I mean, usually I would say remove the foliage if possible because it's just a damaged leaf that is going to be open for other fun things to move in. Some plants, even when they're heavily defoliated, can put out a new flush of growth. So, I mean, there is a possibility, depending on the type of plant, that the new growth might be protected. Sometimes insects are going to be feeding kind of in cycles. And so sometimes that new growth is protected just because it comes out 2 weeks later than the initial feeding. Sometimes you do have to apply some sort of either pesticide or put up some sort of netting or, do some sort of protectant. But yeah, I mean, I think for right now, I would say remove, if there's, horribly tattered foliage, just go ahead and remove that while it's dry so that you're not accidentally spreading any other potential issues. And then kind of water and fertilize and, kind of try and help that plant maybe put out a new flush of growth.
Yeah, that's what I would recommend too. Okay, we'll see if she comments on what plant. We've got another one here from Laura that I think, Laura, we need a little bit more info. Laura commented, just planted an oakleaf hydrangea and the bottom of the leaves seam, and that's where she stopped. So Laura, if you want to let us know what's happening to those bottom of the leaves, we can chat about that. So feel free to add more info. We also had a follow-up comment about last week. Someone asked a question about clipping the growing tip of a bell pepper when it was young to have it branch out. And they said they sent us a video and asked if we watched it, which I haven't watched it yet. So feel free to message us that video again and we'll check it out because we did chat about that last week. And let me see, I think we might be caught up on those. So let me scroll back. We had a question ahead of time. So let's do that one. We've got about 15 minutes left. So if you guys have gardening questions, keep adding them to the comment box and we will get to those today. But Cynthia did ask ahead of time, this spring, my apple trees did not flower. Currently, they're barely producing very small apples, and insects have ravaged the trees. The trees are 14 years old. What can I do to make them beautiful again? So a couple things going on there. Not many flowers, really small apples, insect damage. And she doesn't say what kind of apple tree, if it's a crab apple or if it's a...
yeah, and I think that's
kind
really
of makes a difference, but...
I think that's actually a really important point because things like crab apples or flowering pears are going to, we plant them for a different reason than we do fruit trees. Mm-hmm. And so, and also that really has a huge effect on what type of pesticides can be used, because with a ornamental plant, you don't have to worry about like a post-harvest interval because no part of that plant should be going in your mouth. So you don't have to worry about, how late in the season you can apply pesticides. Whereas with things like apples and pears, and this is also obviously true for like vegetables and other fruits, if you're going to be harvesting it and eating part of that plant, then that's going to be a kind of a different category or a different recommendation. So I wonder, and I don't know where in the state Cynthia is, but I wonder if maybe, again, if there was a frost, if that potentially damaged the flower buds, and so that the flowers just, if they're damaged in bud, then they won't expand into those beautiful flowers. The small apples, it could just be due to, again, like really low vitality. If the plant is suffering from, I would recommend that she look at the base of the plant. We often see problems with deep planting where plants just go straight into the ground like a telephone pole. So if your plants are going into the ground like a lollipop, then that's a problem. And this tends to show up 10, 15 years after transplant. And so you should see like a nice root flare. If you're not seeing that, or if you're seeing damage like cracks or cankers or twisting or peeling or holes in the bark, that can be indicative of obviously the tree being under stress. And then that can result in smaller leaves, smaller flowers, smaller fruit. So that might be a possibility. I think one other thing just to mention is that if people are planting apples and pears and other fruit trees in the expectation of being able to harvest them, you can absolutely do that. But it does tend to be a little bit more intensive care. Then that doesn't necessarily mean, like, again, a strict pesticide management calendar. But there are other things to keep in mind that are going to be, any type of pest. We talked earlier about these fungal leaf spots that are mostly aesthetic. So it's a little annoying, but it doesn't hurt your tree. But if you're relying on that plant to produce fruit or vegetable, not vegetables, but if you're relying on that plant to produce fruit or vegetables, even something that we would normally call aesthetic damage, that's going to impact how much it can photosynthesize. That's going to impact how much energy it has to give to those fruits and vegetables. So, things kind of, you look at them in a slightly different light when you're talking about production plants as opposed to ornamental.
Yeah. And she commented, how do I make it beautiful again? So it sounds like... I
was wondering if it's a crab.
More of a crab, ornamental crab apple. So...
Yeah.
And she said it's 14 years old, so it is possible that planting may be showing up or other...
Right, or other issues, because crab apples can get a number of like cankers and stuff like that. But I think that also kind of calls back to something Ryan mentioned earlier, that, transplant, like when you install a plant, installing it properly is critical, but then also like transplant care can last several years after installation. And we get a lot of people that, they planted a tree earlier in the season, and it's not looking so, it's wilting, it's dropping its leaves, it has leaf dieback. And I say, well, what sort of care are you doing? And they say, oh yeah, no, I watered it every day for the first 2 weeks. Like, well, I mean, that's better than not watering it at all. But that, for in many cases, transplant care will last years. And that may be just watering it supplementary every 2 weeks or so. It does kind of drop off as that plant becomes established. But the first year or so, you really want to baby those plants to a certain extent, because they are, they're put into a whole new environment than we're expecting them to establish and thrive. And we want to do everything we can to encourage that to happen. So I think what Ryan was saying, those first couple of years are really critical. And that doesn't mean that the plant is going to die in that year or two, but it can set up kind of problems further down the road that then are either very difficult to fix or maybe impossible to fix. So really installing the plants properly, spacing them out according to their adult, like their mature size, and not cramming them together. Because I know it looks a lot better when your spruce trees are only 3 feet tall to put them all close together. But they will get bigger. Hopefully that's the plan. So things like that, like paying really careful attention at the beginning can save you a lot of heartbreak later on down the road.
Good point.
If you really want to think more about what's going on with that transplant shock, I mean, that plant's just trying to get its root system outside of that hole that you planted it in, and that's what's the key is just getting that root system expanded out into the undisturbed soil that's outside your planting hole. So when we start talking about watering, it's important to water out beyond the planting hole. So you're drawing roots out there too. So that's maybe more critical, obviously, in year 2 after planting, when you can presume there's maybe some roots that are reaching that area. Even in year 1, like stuff I've planted this year, I am careful to thoroughly water the area all around it, because I do see a lot of folks just have that watering targeted right at the root ball you planted, which is important to get water on, but also think about that and think about your watering method and how it's easy to set up for a little bit further watering further out away from that initial planting. So
that's a good point. Yeah. Okay, we've had a couple good questions come in here. Anne asks, what evergreen would you recommend for a Northwest Chicago suburb that is good for birds and not too tall, over about 30 to 40 feet? So an evergreen, not too tall, good for birds. Got any recommendations, Ryan?
Well, I mean, I think just one of the go-to evergreens for me is like all the different arborvitae cultivars. There's a million different versions of those. And any shape or size that you could think of, probably an arborvitae comes in. I like those because they are just like an absolute dense block of vegetation. When people talk about an evergreen that they want for dividing spaces and things, that's one of my all-time favorites that stay shorter.
Yeah.
I don't know. There's probably some other things in the juniper family. Do you guys have any other favorites that stay a little shorter? I can think of taller things right now off the top of my head.
Yeah.
The under 30 feet requirement kind of limits some of the things.
And I guess it kind of depends on the goal too. Like if you are trying to block something or create a barrier, then I think arborvitae for sure would be I go to, but there's also a lot of more kind of ornamental specimen kind of evergreens too that would be more for a landscape choice too. And then in terms of birds, I'm certainly not a bird expert, but I don't know that any evergreens are going to be a food source for birds, but as a nesting site and things like that, I suppose you would have.
Yeah, a lot of them add that element of shelter in the wintertime because it's evergreen. All our deciduous trees lose all their leaves, obviously. So, I think, again, I'm not a bird expert, but I think from a standpoint of a lot of birds, just having that, leaf structure there and in place for some shelter in the wintertime is the main thing they provide. I'd say there's probably some examples of eastern red cedar, for example. It has a lot of berries that berry-like structures that are actually cones. Birds like.
I believe that birds can eat yew berries. And so yews usually don't get super tall, so they may not be what she's looking for in terms of a tree. They tend to be more like shrub. But yews don't have a ton of insect or pest problems that I'm aware of, and the berries can be eaten by birds. They're also toxic to humans, I believe. So if you've got small kids, maybe not the best, but
I was like, well, yew has those great red berry-like cones, and I know they're poisonous to humans, but I couldn't remember about animals. So
I believe that I just did just looked up a quick reference, and it says that it's safe for birds.
Perfect. Excellent. And then someone commented that junipers might be good for birds too, cedar waxwings in particular. So. Okay, let me see. We've got about 5 minutes left, so I want to try to get these last questions in here. Mary asks, I have 2 mandevilla vines adjacent to each other. One is thriving. The other one started strong, but is now suffering. Leaves are still green. There's no discoloration. They have flower buds, but they're not opening. She doesn't see any insects. It did get a large amount of rainwater a few weeks ago, falling from overwhelmed gutters. Any thoughts on what could be the difference there?
I always look, and I've had this happen with a lot of my vines. I planted a number of vines on trellises this year, and I thought like, oh, I'm going to have this beautiful, like, even green kind of wall. Yeah, no. I've had like one really strong plant, one kind of sad plant, one really strong plant. It's a little more varied than I was expecting. But usually when I've taken a quick look at it, it comes down to, at least in my experience, like, if you look at the base of the plant, it can just have to do with like root development, and which is not something you can really easily see, by looking at what you can see in the plant. You'd have to dig it up, which I don't necessarily recommend because that's stressful. But even something that just kind of like makes the vine kind of delayed by a week or two. So if there was anything, if the roots weren't quite as strong, or if there was something that happened where it got a little damage to the base of the plant, or it got a little damaged and it just kind of got delayed by a week or two, that can have a huge difference, especially like around now in the growing season where a lot of our plants are kind of taking off, and you're expecting your other plant to take off as well, and it's not. So, and again, that's kind of my limited anecdotal experience from just dealing with this happening in my backyard. But I could tell like the plants that when I planted them, I was like, oh, this one has a slightly smaller root system, but I'm sure it'll be fine. And like, yeah, it'll live and it'll grow, but it's definitely delayed compared to the others. So that, I mean, since there's the lack, she hasn't seen any insects, she doesn't see any discoloration, things like that. It to me sounds more like it's an abiotic stress. So something else is affecting that plant.
Yeah, and as long as that container, I shouldn't say container or ground, but I suppose as long as that area where it got a large rainwater, as long as it had drainage and was able to drain away, that shouldn't have caused too much of an issue. But yeah, I think that's a good point. Okay, question here. Do sugar maple trees have a history of incurring diseases? I have 2 of them cut down. Should anything be done to the soil after being cut down?
No, I mean, I guess it depends on why those trees were cut down or like why they died. And this kind of comes back to what Ryan talked about. It's going to depend on the situation. Generally speaking, we don't recommend doing too much in a lot of those areas for a couple of reasons. The most probably serious disease I could think of that the maples potentially could have died from would be verticillium wilt. And verticillium wilt can persist in the soil, and it has a very wide range of hosts. So it could affect other plants that you plant in that area. There isn't really good reclamation though for the soil, and I don't think there's any that's recommended for like homeowner use. In high value nurseries, they'll sterilize their potting material, their soil, or they'll sterilize field soil like in California with strawberries. But that comes with its own set of problems because we actually want our soil to have a lot of microorganisms in it. We don't want sterile soil. So what I would recommend is if they died due to old age or they just kind of, slowly declined or something like that, you probably don't need to do anything. If they died due to verticillium wilt, and there's a couple of good articles, Home Yard and Garden on verticillium wilt. So if you know what the symptoms look like, you might be able to kind of think about, is this a possibility? Then I would recommend considering planting non-hosts in that area. There are a lot of plants that do get verticillium wilt, so that's frustrating, but there are a lot of plants that don't. And so I would consider planting non-hosts, so that way if they did die due to verticillium, you're not, again, setting yourself up for failure when you plant highly susceptible plants back in that area. I would just kind of try and not even have to worry about that problem and select a non-host.
Very good. Excellent. Okay, we've got 3 final questions. Next one's about arborvitae. I have approximately 40 to 50 arborvitae. One of them this year started turning brown, and we tried to save it. It's got a little bit of green life. It's not bagworms, and we are not out in the country, and I tried to keep them watered. Any idea why it's dying? So if it's not bagworms, they're trying to keep them watered. Other thoughts on dying arborvitae?
There are a lot of fungal needle blights on arborvitae, and we've seen a lot of them this spring. It was a good spring for fungal diseases. So it's probably something like Phylosticta needle blight or Pestilodiopsis needle blight. Those are kind of the 2 most common. I think we've seen a little bit of Diplodia. I'm trying to think of the arborvitae we've seen so far this year. The good news is that it is treatable, although one thing to keep in mind with evergreens, so the bonus of evergreens is that they don't shed their needles in winter. Like you have that evergreen, so that's lovely. The bad news is that if the needles die, they do not grow back. So if you have like an evergreen new needles might develop at the tips of the branches, but those dead needles are never regreening or regrowing. So if you have one tree that's like heavily affected and it's never going to be pretty, or it's going to take another 3 decades to be aesthetically pleasing, honestly, I personally would just remove it, because it's just acting as a giant source of inoculum. It's still not going to look good for quite a long time. It's not worth the effort to try and save it if it's still going to be ugly, if the whole point is to be pretty, or to act as a windbreak. So yeah, I will add in the chat box the management for the fungal needle blights. And that's maybe something that you want to do to the adjacent trees as a protectant, essentially, or if you start to notice symptoms. But if you've got 1 or 2 trees that are like heavily affected, I personally would let those go and then consider either replanting in a year or 2, or just have a slightly shorter row, or, kind of come up with another solution, because trying to save, like if a tree is 80% dead, it's going to be a hard row to hoe.
Okay.
So I'd say with arborvitae, I've also seen a lot of environmental.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that I've seen they're super sensitive to is planting depth and drainage. If you really don't, if some of those spots where you're seeing more dead trees than more dead looking trees has poor drainage, I think that's something we could point to. I think planting depth is incredibly important with these, because they're pretty susceptible to girdling roots that can develop later. Now, if these are newly planted, unless you really overlooked a girdling root at planting time, I don't think it would have this quick of an effect. But as you go to replant, really try and identify that root flare well, or that root collar. And a lot of times on a balled and burlapped or container grown arborvitae, it's really hard to find that true like root trunk flare that we'd see. So really you're kind of digging down into the container or the balled and burlap and looking for that first root is more what you're going to find on an arborvitae trunk for a younger arborvitae. So I'd say some of your arborvitaes in that row of your planting that maybe aren't looking as great, it would probably be worth trying to excavate and find that root flare or find that first root. And if you do that, you would carefully dig around the trunk with a small hand trowel or something, trying to find, again, first root or what you think is the trunk flare. Leave that exposed after that, and that's going to help those trees. So I think that's, beyond what Diane's talking about with pathogens, I think that's one of the other things I would want to check off my list for any of those that are ailing that you feel like you still have enough left you could save, or even some of the other ones you already planted. It may be worth kind of going back and just making sure planting depth was right on some of the healthy ones as well.
Yeah, and I very much agree with that, just because a lot of the needle tip blights that we see, much like with like Diplodia, which we talked about earlier, it tends to affect mostly the new needles. So if you're seeing like progressive death over the course of a season, then there's probably something else going on as well. And like Ryan mentioned, those sorts of deep planting issues, girdling root issues can definitely cause a pretty drastic decline. Yeah.
Okay, 2 more questions. Question here about redbud. They said they had a redbud that grew about 5 feet last year. This year it died except for some growth at the base, at the bottom. They cut out the dead wood, and the growth at the bottom has grown 4 feet so far this year. So she wants to know, will it die again next year? It is mulched. So kind of hard to say.
I can't think of something common with redbuds.
Yeah.
I saw something kind of similar with a lot of Japanese maples this year. And again, I think it was that like late freeze that occurred where you'd have an entirely dead tree and then you'd have little like tufts of growth at the bottom. I didn't notice that with redbuds, but I wonder if maybe something similar like that could have happened.
Yeah, that was my figure too, that it was winter damage or some type of damage. It sounds like she's doing the right. It's mulched. Hopefully you're watering it, keeping it healthy. So it sounds like you're doing the right thing. And just kind of have to hope for the best next year.
It must have some good roots down there.
Yeah.
4-foot tall sprouts. So
yeah.
Okay, so we'll finish it off today with a white pine question. Does anybody have any general feelings and or talking points about white pines? I'm considering having several white pines put in this fall. I'm selecting white pine because I like the soft look of them. They have lots of room, mostly sun. And they're hoping to not plant something with disease issues, whether current diseases or any that you hear are starting to affect white pine. So I guess just comment about typical diseases for white pines and if that's a good choice.
I will quickly comment on that, and then I'm going to leave time for Ryan to mention if he has other comments on white pine. White pines, I will be honest, I hate seeing come in the clinic because they don't get too many disease issues, which is good, but it means that then they're always a challenge. In many cases, when we see issues with white pines, there are some insects, some caterpillar and other insects that will chew on the needles, but those are not super common. The big problem that I see with white pine is that there are some root issues that seem to be affecting white pine. There's something called white pine decline, which is a very unsatisfactory answer, but it's kind of a root rot complex. It tends to be found in soils that are not, I believe that they're not acidic enough, because I believe that white pines like a slightly more acidic soil. So if you end up with soil that is not, really well suited for those pines, then they're more likely to develop this root issue. Also, heavy clay soil, I believe, is not recommended. So I would say, if you're going to do white pine, I don't want to put you off of white pine because I think that they can be a really good choice, and they're definitely better than like a bunch of Colorado blue spruce or something. So good job. But I would say, maybe do a little bit of research and see like what is recommended, like what's their ideal situation, and then do you might want to do a soil test or check to make sure that you are planting them into an area that is going to be good for them both above ground but also underground. And if you are planting them into, if your soil is not acidic enough, let's say, then amend that before you start planting. So that to me, the biggest problem with white pine would be that potential white pine decline issue that we sometimes see show up. So Ryan, do you have any other thoughts?
I can comment just in my experience as an arborist of what do I think of white pine. Well, I really do like it as far as a native conifer I can recommend, a native evergreen. That's really tops my list. And, it's not necessarily native to every single county of the state, but it's native to Illinois. I also recommend it a lot of times when folks want something that grows fast. They grow really fast and make a nice tree quickly. One thing that can pretty safely be said about fast growing trees is their wood fiber is not as strong. So the biggest problem I see with white pines are breakouts during storms, during windstorms, during ice storms, especially. They just are not super, it's not a super dense wood fiber on a white pine. So to me, that's kind of what I always advise folks on. Like, I love them. I plant them on my property, but I just know someday half that tree could be stripped down by an ice storm. That happened to one of mine where, a limb at the very top gets too heavy, it breaks, it hits the next one, hits the next one, hits the next one. You've got half of the tree kind of on the side. So maybe if you're in a super exposed spot, if it's a super windy spot in rural Illinois, that's maybe not the best place. But most other places, they do really well. They grow quickly. Diane really hit the nail on the head, I think, with some of those, soil acidity is an issue. They tend to suffer from iron chlorosis if we get too high of too alkaline of soils. The last thing is maybe they are pretty susceptible to girdling roots. I've seen a lot of girdling roots on white pines over the years. But that's something that is totally solvable at planting time. Just be sure you plant it at the correct depth. And if you find any of those girdling roots in the root ball or the potential girdling roots or in the container or root ball, go ahead and snip those at the time you plant. So.
Excellent. Okay. Thank you for that info, guys. So we are over our time, so we're going to cut it off there with questions, but thank you guys for all the awesome questions today, and thank you, Diane, for joining us, bringing your expertise.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah, so our next show is going to be on August 12th, so in 2 weeks we'll be back on with another special guest. We're going to have Peggy Doty on, who's an extension educator, and our focus for that day is going to be living with wildlife. So I'm going to quiz her all about the dang moles or voles or whatever in my lawn that I've been dealing with. So bring your questions on August 12th. And as always, don't forget we have a Facebook group, our Extension Horticulture group, that we've added in the comments box. You can ask questions there at any time in between shows. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. We'll see you again next time.
See ya.
Bye.